Welcome, welcome. How are you guys? Good. We're very intimate today. Welcome to the 9:15 service. The last week that we're doing two services is great. I love it. I mean, I would love for everybody to come up to the front two rows. I'm just kidding. You don't have to move. It's okay. Don't freak out. But hey, we're holding it down, and it's been a fun time doing the two services. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it as much as I have. Before we get into it today, I just wanted to remind you that we are going to one service again next week, 10 a.m. We'll be back to it. But man, it worked really great for Easter. We had over 180 people here last week, so between the two services, it was great to have the space, especially out in the lobby, especially for our kids, especially in the parking lot, so it worked really well. So maybe we'll come back again to two services once we start reaching those numbers on a regular basis. We may have to do it again on a big day, I don't know, but it worked out really well. And can we also celebrate that God saved a few people last week at Easter? Can we celebrate that together? I mean, I think that's awesome. God did that. I'm hearing multiple stories come out of last week. A few in particular stick out, which are really awesome, and so it's just been really cool to see that. And listen, I want to encourage you again, if you believed for the first time last week, if that was you, whether you're listening online, whether you're here in person, I want to encourage you to take your first step of obedience, which is baptism. Because when you believe, it's time to get baptized. That's what the New Testament teaches us, is that the next step of obedience in following Jesus is to be baptized, to proclaim to the world, to show everyone outwardly of what Jesus has done inwardly in your life. And so we want to encourage you to do that. We still have the baptism cards on your seat. You can fill that out, drop it in the bucket on the way out, or you can come up and talk to our prayer counselors after the service today. But I hope that you will take that first step of obedience, because we're going to be baptizing next week, just like Michael said, and it's going to be really fun to do that. And so I hope that if that's you, you will sign up and take advantage of that. Don't wait. Delayed obedience is disobedience. And so you don't want to start your faith journey with Jesus in disobedience in that way. So I'd highly encourage that for you. But hey, today, let's switch gears and get into what we're doing today. We're starting a brand new series called DTR, Relationships According to the Bible. And so we try to do something on relationships every year, just because being in relationships is a part of the human experience, is it not? They're very important for us, our relationships that we have. We can't live without them. And so the Bible has a lot to teach us on the subject. So you can go ahead and turn to John chapter 15 today, verses 9 through 17. That's where we will be in the Bible. You can find it on your Bible app. You can follow along in your Bible. We'll have it on the screens for you as well if you need it. But in the coming weeks, as we talk about this relationship series, we're going to talk about different kinds of relationships. We're going to talk about relationships between the two genders, male and female. We're going to talk about dating and singleness. We're going to talk about biblical marriage. We're going to talk about LGBTQ plus issues. We're going to talk about parenting in the last week on Mother's Day for the parent commissioning that Michael mentioned during our announcements. So just that's so you have an idea of where we're going in this series. That's what we're going to be talking about. But friendship is really the foundation of all of those relationships in some sense, because it's a reflection of our nature to bear God's image in the world. The Bible teaches us at the very beginning we're made to be like God, and the relationships that we have and the people that we know are a part of how we do that with one another. Of course, it starts with the man and the woman in the garden, if you remember from Genesis chapters 1 and 2, which we'll get to in the series here. We'll go there and we'll talk about biblical marriage from that and all of that, maybe even next week for the gender discussion. But that leads to the first family. But foundationally, it's this idea that we're made for community with other people, like God himself is in community, right? It's the Trinitarian nature of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that oneness is what we all long for with both God and with one another in other relationships with other people. I mean, it's God's own nature. It's the foundation of the concept of friendship. And when we don't have deep and meaningful friendships in our life, man, it goes against who we are as humans, and it impacts us in emotional, spiritual, maybe even mental ways, in negative ways, right? When we don't have deep, close friendships, it's at all costs, we need to learn to cultivate friendships in our life. So if you're taking notes and you want to write this down, here's our main point for today. We should cultivate friendships with candor and consistency. Now, I could have gone in multiple different directions with this. I think I almost just said we need friends. That could have been the main point, We just all need friends. We need to make sure that we're cultivating friendships. But I want to go with candor and consistency today, and we'll break down what those words mean as we get into our text. But it's vital that we walk away with tools for how to cultivate healthy, long-lasting friendships and what that looks like for us. I read an article a few weeks ago in Inc.com titled Want to Raise More Successful and Happier Kids? Harvard research says give them more chores. And what's interesting when I read the article is the conclusion of why chores are what leads to more successful and more happy kids. And the reason is that chores help children grow up to be more likely less self-centered in their lives. That's what the article argues leads to happiness. Let me read a quote from the article. It said, kids who feel involved in shared responsibilities and who feel a part of a larger ecosystem derive a greater sense of self-worth. Okay, that's good. But then they also become able to see the needs of people around them and are therefore more willing to help others. In short, they become less self-centered. If you do everything for me and I don't have to participate, clearly the world must revolve around me. That's the idea. But the article goes on to argue that happiness and success, even according to modern psychology, is learning to live a more others-centered life, not a more self-centered life. That's so interesting to me in our current American culture. So next time your kids whine about having to pick up their toys or fold and put away their clothes, you just remind them that it's for their own good, okay? So I think my parents might have said that to me once or twice. It's for your own good, right? They'll be happier. They'll thank you later in life, hopefully. You know, that's the idea here. So it's almost become cliche to talk about, I think, but the loneliness epidemic in our nation is real. And the sad thing is, people are living this way every day, especially the younger generations. The younger you get, the more depressed people are, and they're not connecting in the most important ways. I mean, we'd rather text someone who's somewhere else than to engage the people who are right in front of us in real life. We don't know how to cultivate real intimate relationships without some kind of medium in between, like social media or text or phone or whatever it is. And I'm sure there's a variety of reasons for that. I'm sure COVID plays into it. We like to blame everything on COVID, right? I'm sure it's social media. I'm sure it's the cultural milieu that we're in. We live in a culture that tells us to be more selfish, to be more individualistic. It's all about what you want and what's going to make you happy. And the thing is, that culture and the gospel it's preached to us has left us wanting. We all know that we need more than what we're getting in the American culture. And the Bible tells us what modern psychology is starting to figure out, perhaps, that we just need to cultivate real friendships. We need people. And we'll see from our text today that it takes candor and consistency to do that. This is what Jesus is going to teach. So this is what he says according to John's Gospel, chapter 15, verse 9. Let's read this together and let's talk about it. He said, I've loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I've told you these things so that you'll be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. Man, everything that's come before this is about how much God loves either the world or his disciples or both. And he's just talked about how he's the vine. If you remember the beginning of John 15's kind of a famous, chapter in John's gospel, and he talks about being the vine, we're the branches. As his disciples, we can do nothing apart from him. So he says his disciples are to remain in his love. And if they obey his commands, he says here, they will prove to be remaining in his love. So in other words, if they want to see fruit produced in their lives, then they have to be connected to the vine. And if they stay connected to the vine by remaining in his love and remaining and following his commandments, it will bring joy in their lives. Last week we talked about this for Easter even, what joy looks like. How does our joy overflow? Well, it's learning to love God and love others in appropriate ways. And Jesus wants their love and ours to overflow. So he says, remain in my love, and then learn how to love one another. Because he goes on in verse 12, this is my commandment. If you want to obey Jesus, he says, and remain in his love, this is my commandment, love each other in the same way I have loved you. How has he loved us? Verse 13, there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you slaves because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. Now you're my friends since I've told you everything the Father has told me. Now what's everything Jesus has told them? Well, essentially it's the gospel. It's who he is, what he's here to do in the world. He's made clear God's plan to save humanity from sin, and now he's giving that knowledge. And soon he's going to give his Holy Spirit to his disciples. And that intimacy that he has, that's what's made them friends. They're intimate with him now. They don't just do his bidding, they are friends with God. Verse 16, he says, you didn't choose me, though, I chose you. I appoint you to go and produce lasting fruit so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. This is my command, love each other. It's really an incredible teaching by Jesus here, honestly. I mean, What Jesus is saying is revolutionary in some ways, and he's saying there are benefits of knowing him as our friend, basically. There's joy that's produced. There's meaning. I know some people might look in at this, though, and say, well, they might be incredulous to the idea that we can be friends with Jesus. How can God be our friend? Isn't that sacrilegious? Isn't that, irreverent? We've all heard or maybe seen the T-shirts that's like, Jesus is my homeboy, Like, that's wrong. That's irreverent. And maybe that's true, maybe, but this is why religious people hate real Christianity so much. Because Jesus says here that it's both. It's not an either-or scenario. It's a both-and kind of thing. Yeah, he's the vine and we're the branches. We can do nothing apart from him. Yeah, he's the only way to get to the Father. Yes, he's the eternal Son of God who's present at the foundation of the world and who's going to come back as King of the universe, clothed in power and glory one day. Yes, he is that. But also he says here that when he chooses a person, we can be his friend. He literally says that. I mean, think about Moses and Abraham, even in the Old Testament. What are they known as in the Old Testament? Friends of God, right? Why? Well, it probably had something to do with their intimacy with God, but really more specifically, his intimacy with them. And what Jesus is saying here of his disciples is that they can be intimate with him. They're not just people who follow his bidding blindly and do whatever he says, although they might be that, right? That's obedience to him. But they're his friends because it's a two-way relationship. He's chosen them, he loves them, and they love him back. That's what friendship is. It's this mutual relationship that we create with somebody else. So what Jesus is saying can certainly be applied to our relationships and our friendships as well. So let me just make a few observations here for us. Jesus said, now you're my friends since I've told you everything the Father told me. Okay, well, what's that mean? Well, it means that he was willing to let them into his life in an intimate way. And so this is the first point you can write down: cultivate friendship with candor. Okay? We have to be willing to let other people into our lives like Jesus did here and be vulnerable with them. That's all I mean by the word candor. It's your ability to be real. It's your ability to be vulnerable. It's your ability to be authentic. That's the word we use here a lot at our church, right? It's one of our core values, authentic community. We want to be real with one another. If you're going to make a real friend, you have to be real with them, and they have to be real with you. You have to be transparent. You have to be open and share yourself. You can't just put up a wall. They have to be able to know you. You have to be able to know them, the good, the bad, the ugly, the things you don't want other people to see necessarily. This is what community groups are for at our church, but especially DNA groups. These DNA groups are groups of 2 to 4 people, same gender, similar life stage, and it's because we're trying to be open and transparent with one another and create that safe space here at our church for you to be able to do that with someone else. We want you to be able to be vulnerable. We want you to be able to put yourself out there without feeling like you're risking too much. We need people to be able to let our hair down with. We need people that we don't have to put a mask on, put up a front, And yeah, that kind of intimacy comes with risks. There's no doubt about that. That's what it means to be vulnerable. I mean, you're vulnerable to what? Attack, right? You're vulnerable to being hurt, yes. But see, in the same vein, that vulnerability, when shown to the right people, that can lead to deep intimacy. And that's what friendship should look like. In the Bible, it's this idea of souls being knit together with one another, with a common purpose, this common spirit. It's deeper than even sexual intimacy, by the way, if I could just say it that way, because at its core, friendship is spiritual in that way. I mean, in the Bible, this idea of souls being knit together is so much deeper than sex even, because in marriage, if we just use that as an example, sex is a byproduct of that level of intimacy, at least it's meant to be. It's marriage then sex, it's not sex then marriage for a reason. Because the relationship that you create, that's the thing that leads to the physical intimacy in marriage. The friendship that you have as spouses leads to more and more intimacy. But see, it starts with that spiritual, emotional intimacy of a friendship. So friendship is much deeper than even a physical relationship. It's a common spirit. It's like what Paul wrote in Philippians 2 that we studied a few months ago. Having the same mind, the same spirit, the same purpose, the same mission. You're going after the same things in life. It's like what we see in the Bible with Jonathan and David as well. They're a great example. They're one of maybe the most famous examples of friendship in the Bible. In 1 Samuel 18, right after David killed Goliath, it shows us, what this friendship was founded on. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. And there was an immediate bond between them. For Jonathan loved David, and Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. I mean, this is what's beautiful about friendship. Jonathan would have been the next king if you kind of understand the whole ecosystem of how kingships worked back then. He was Saul's son. He would have been the king, but he knew something special about David. He actually trusted God with David because he knew that David was called to be the next king, and he befriended him anyway, and he committed himself and his family to David. So friendship is the idea of loving someone so much that it's like loving yourself, and Jonathan lays down his own birthright to be lifelong friends with David, and then David ends up taking care of Jonathan's son after Jonathan dies on the battlefield with Saul. So if you remember that, I mean, it's really the opposite of religiosity. You know, I mean, religiosity puts up a front. It puts up an appearance of trying to act a certain way and be a certain way and make certain choices so that you appear this way to either God, yourself, to others. But see, true friendship is completely authentic. It's a true sharing of yourself, and it's laying yourself down and making yourself vulnerable. It's showing charity, it's showing love, it's showing grace, forgiveness, all of these things because you love the other person in this friendship like you love yourself. And who do you show more grace and mercy to than yourself, right? You're supposed to do that for other people. And then Jesus talks about remaining with his disciples and them remaining with him. So let's switch gears as we get into the next thing. He says in verse 9, I've loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. So there's a consistency and a constancy here, or remaining for friendship. You can write this down as our second point today. Cultivate friendship with consistency. So there's candor, there's vulnerability, openness, authenticity, but then there's consistency here. And consistency means being there for one another. It just means, another way to say that is trusting one another. There's a trust in relationships like this, and that trust takes time and intentionality. That's why you have to be consistent. Trust takes work. It doesn't just happen by accident to trust someone. You have to remain, as Jesus says here. You have to prove it out over time, in other words, So it's like cultivating a garden. Just think about what Jesus has taught here right at the beginning of the chapter. He uses this kind of agricultural language for a reason. He's the vine, we're the branches, the Father is the gardener. I mean, this agricultural language talks about, he moves into talking about friendship here right afterwards. So I think he's making the connection for us. It takes time and intentionality, like gardening does. You have to plant a seed when you garden. You have to water it and give it sunlight, nourish it in appropriate ways. You have to prune it to keep it healthy as it grows. And then, after you do all those things, over time, it produces a harvest and you see fruit and there's joy in your life for that. That's the growth of a friendship over time, is it not? You have to plant seeds of trust with someone. Then you have to nourish those seeds in the relationship with time and communication and consistency. And you might have to prune some things in the relationship in order to help that relationship grow, in order to help one another mature and produce fruit. But then when you do all those things over time with consistency and intentionality, man, you get fruit and there's joy. And that's the joy Jesus is talking about here in this text. So for us, our friendships will naturally include a measure of both consistency and candor. If you're like me, though, you immediately put up a defense and say, and you make excuses. You know you're not always going to be candid. You know you're not always consistent perfectly, even with the people you love the most, perhaps. You'll hold things back. You're afraid, right? You don't want to get hurt. You don't want to make the time, whatever it is. And unfortunately, it's even worse than we think. Because what Jesus is saying here is that to be real friends with anybody and to truly love the way that he loves his disciples, you have to be willing to give up your entire life for a friendship. You have to be willing to lay yourself down. All of yourself. That's the way to cultivate a true friendship. It's becoming selfless, not selfish, in every way. Putting the needs of others before your own. Serving others instead of yourself. But the problem is, friendship takes sacrifice, and we're selfish. So the real problem is that we're selfish. It takes sacrifice, but we don't want to sacrifice. If you're like me, again, you get defensive about those things. You're like, I know what it's required. I just can't. I've been through too many hurts in my life. I've had too many people hurt me. I have to protect myself. I have to serve myself. Nobody else is going to look out for me. I have to look out for myself. Problem is our selfishness. That's what Jesus is saying here. And listen, I don't think the Bible is saying to abandon self-care at all. I don't think he's saying to be a slave to other people and that's the only way to be friends with them. I don't think he's saying let people abuse you or anything like that. But he is pointing to himself here as the standard for us in friendship. And the problem is none of us measure up to that standard. Jesus is saying he's the perfect friend. We're not. When our friendships go awry, it's usually because we're not candid, we're not consistent. Maybe a combination of the two of these things. I mean, you might struggle with the relationships, for example, in your life because maybe you're opening yourself up too much with someone. I struggle with this sometimes. I can be a little too real, right? I can share maybe a little too much too soon, and it scares other people off. They're not ready for it yet. We haven't established those seeds of trust enough, and people get freaked out, and so maybe that's your problem too. Maybe you go in too deep too quick, or maybe it's the opposite for you, and you don't open yourself up enough. Maybe you're so closed off, people think they can't be themselves around you. Maybe they don't feel like you're real and you've put up a mask and so they don't want to talk to you about it and they don't want to grow in their relationship. Maybe it's a candor issue either way. Or maybe it's a consistency issue for you. Maybe the people around you aren't sure they can count on you and that you're going to be there for them because you're not willing to give more time, more of yourself. You inconsistently show up to things that you committed to be at. You don't text people back in a timely fashion or maybe at all. You ghost people, I think is the term that we use nowadays. Maybe you're just generally not trustworthy. I don't know. Maybe the term flaky applies to you. I'm not sure. But we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. We want to be friends with people, but we want them to do all those things for us. We want them to be consistent with us. We want them to be candid with us, and we're just not willing to do it for them because we're selfish. And do you know what the root of that selfishness is? I mean, at its basic root, what Jesus is saying here in the text is that we're not friends with, we don't understand his friendship with us yet, completely. Because see, at its core, our selfishness and failure to be good friend is an idolatry issue. Like we want people to come to us on our terms. We want to be pursued. We want to feel loved. We want to feel like we're worth being pursued by somebody else. That's where we derive our self-worth and our self-love. We're just not willing to do that for other people. We want them to do it for us. We're just not going to do it for them because we need that kind of love. The problem is friendship takes sacrifice and we're selfish. We need people is what we think. We do need someone. The problem is it's not some other human being. We don't need someone else's friendship in order to be whole. We don't need someone else's love in order to be whole. We need someone who can be perfectly candid with us. We need someone who can be perfectly consistent toward us. We need someone who's willing to pursue us at all times and to choose us and to sacrifice himself completely in order to make us his friend. Jesus said in verse 13, there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. I chose you. That's the good news that we believe, isn't it? That in some sense, Jesus loved the entire world so much that he gave his only son's life. God gave his only son. That's John 3:16, in order to make the world know him, right? Anybody who puts their faith in him can know Jesus. But also in a very specific sense, he chooses those whom he saves, and he makes us his friend. We were his enemy, and he made us his friend. So we've all made ourselves enemies of God by making friends with things in the world. That's what we want. We want people to love us. We want things to love us. We want things to serve us. But the problem is all those things that we want in our life that's not God, they will always fail us. Every time. We look for intimacy in all the wrong places. Things that will enslave us and keep us from the joy that Jesus wants for our life. Think about what he's saying here. He's saying things like love of money, a perversion of sex, or abuse of power and control, any number of things that we look to for love and validation and self-worth, they will always let us down and leave us wanting. But see, Jesus chose us. He says he died for his enemies in order to make us his friends. Jesus died for us to make us his friends. In our earthly relationships, we might need to choose others at times. We might need to pursue them. We might need to show them love and go after them. But see, Jesus chose us in order to show us his love. He pursued us. He came after us. He did that perfectly on our behalf. Earthly friendships are mutual even, right? We have to have this mutuality to our relationships in order to be able to trust one another, in order to be able to be friends with someone. But see, Jesus' sacrifice was completely one-sided on our behalf. He sacrificed everything, completely vulnerable, completely laid bare, making himself human, laying down his own deity and his own power to become vulnerable to the point of death for us. But he was also perfectly consistent. And he is perfectly consistent even now because he came to earth on a mission that he completed. His face set like flint for the task before him. But now he's consistently with us, never leaving or forsaking us, always with us, even to the end of the age. That's true friendship. That's what Jesus does for us. Jesus is saying that to God, we were worth it. He chose us. He chose to pursue us. We were worth it so much that he lived and died for us. In our place, he pursued us. And then he defeated death so that one day when eternity becomes reality for us, we can be friends with him forever. We can be forever friends in that way. So we don't need another human being. We don't need an earthly relationship to fulfill us in that way. We'll talk about that with marriage some too. But we often look to friendships for this, earthly friendships, and we don't need that. We have the greatest friend who's ever lived. We have Jesus who's chosen us. So now all of our other relationships, all of our friendships that we have can be founded on that friendship that he has with us. So that leads to a few points of application here. I have two. I'll try to go quickly here for the sake of time today. This is our first one. Our deepest friendships should be with others who are also friends with Jesus. That's where it starts. It's going to be hard to be intimate with somebody who doesn't know Jesus. We're not going to be able to cultivate that level of depth, that level of intimacy, vulnerability to be able to trust someone else. I know we kind of use the word friend a lot like we use the word love nowadays, you know. I love ice cream, but I also love my wife. Okay, well, same word, but a little bit different meaning, right? A little bit different weight of depth to it, I hope, right? I mean, that's what I do love ice cream, but, you know, I'm not as much as you, babe. Okay, so I hope that makes you feel good, right? I mean, it's like that with the word friend, too. You know, we might have friends on Facebook that we've never even met. We might have friends at school or at work that we're kind of tangentially in relationship with, but then you have your friends, right? People you're close to. People that maybe you would even say are real friends, close friends, best friends, we might say. People who can count on you and you can count on them. And if you just become a believer, maybe this is hard for you, especially even over Easter or recently, and you've just started following Jesus, it might be hard to understand. And I'm not saying you don't want to have friends outside of the church or anything like that. I'm not saying you need to break off relationships with people that don't know Jesus. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I want you to understand that those relationships will fade over time if they don't know Jesus, because you do. He's your true friend. You've gone to him for love and validation and support and friendship, and they haven't yet. Now, maybe they will one day, and the friendship that you have that you can cultivate with them will lead to friendship with Jesus. But what I'm trying to help you understand is that it will change over time, your relationship with them, if they don't come to know Jesus, because you have an intimacy that they don't have. You have a source of hope that they don't have. You have a source of love and deep friendship that they don't have. So make sure that you're cultivating relationships with people who don't know Jesus, but your friendship with them may change over time, which is one reason why you do need to get plugged in hard here at our church if you're here. You need friendships like this. You think about it. We give you 5 practices here that are based off of Acts chapter 2 to help you grow in your faith with God, and most people disassociate that with other folks. They disassociate it with their relationships and their friendships. But listen, when I give you the 5 G's, I want you to understand that 4 out of 5 of those are others-oriented. They're based on relationships that you'll create here. They're gospel, gather, groups, give, and go. Gather, groups, give, and go are all others-oriented. Those are all things you do with other people. You gather with others on a Sunday like this to worship God together collectively. You group with people so that you can get in those intimate relationships. You give for the sake of the mission, and people are the mission. You go to reach others, other people. These are all others-oriented. That's how you're going to grow and mature in your faith. You've got to plug in hard to relationships. You got to cultivate those relationships over time with candor and consistency. You need that level of intimacy in your life, to have true friendships, and to grow and mature in your faith with God. And that's what's awesome about the church, is that those friendships will all be over time consistent, over time growing. If we're all growing toward Jesus in relationship, then we'll all grow toward one another in relationship as well. And what's really cool about the church is that that's going to be with totally different people sometimes. And there's going to be a diversity in that is so beautiful. And that's part of where the joy comes from. People might be from a different neighborhood in Roanoke. I know in Roanoke, if you're not from Roanoke, you don't understand the divide perhaps that is northwest, southwest, northeast, and southeast. Those people don't cross most of the time in life. But see, in God's economy with friendships, somebody who lives in southeast can become friends with somebody in southwest. Somebody in northeast can become friends with somebody in northwest. In all of these different ways, God can do that through the friendships here. There's diversity here in that. Somebody might be from a different culture, a different country, a different ethnic background. Somebody might have a different skin color, right? But none of that matters. Not that it's all erased or goes away, but none of that matters in the friendship and the foundation of our friendship. It's beautiful because it's multi-ethnic, it's an HD kind of thing, as Derwin Gray talks about, in all the different colors. It's beautiful because we're coming together not in a biological sense as a biological family, not in some hobby that we have together, but we're coming together because we're all friends with Jesus and he's chosen us, and now we can be friends with one another. I love how deep it goes, because I heard one pastor say one time, the gospel's thicker than blood. Even your biological family may not be as close to you as somebody who you're friends with in Christ, because the gospel is thicker than blood. Jesus' blood is the thing that brings us together, not a family bloodline, not an ethnic bloodline. And what knits the church together is these deep friendships that Jesus is talking about here in this passage. No matter who we are, where we're from, what we look like, it doesn't matter. There's a beauty in that diversity, and there's way more I could say there and probably should, but the second point of application I have for us today is this: true friends aren't selfish, they're selfless. And of course, we've already said this, but I just want to point it out very specifically. What does that look like in your own life? No, we're never going to be perfect in this, but because of the gospel, we can grow in it, right? We're friends with Jesus now. We're operating out of his friendship in our life. How can we now be friends with others and pursue others in a similar way that he's pursued us? We don't have to wait for other people to come to us, in other words. That's what it looks like to be selfless in a friendship. You take the initiative and go to someone else. And I know that in our culture, we just don't do that. But this is countercultural. We might have to learn how to do that. And one of the tools I want to give you real quick is how to define our relationships with people in order to do it. Yeah, I said it, right? DTR. There it is. Define our relationships. Now, what I don't mean is you go up to people and you try to define the relationship you have with them, okay? You don't want to do that. I think you and I are not close friends at all, but we're somewhere here. You don't want to do that with somebody, okay? But in your own mind, you go through the people that you know and you start to define, how am I relating to these people? A helpful way to think about it is concentric circles. We have our closest friends in the center. This is what Jesus is talking about here, people with whom we're completely vulnerable, completely consistent. We drop anything to help them, they drop anything to help us. That's probably going to start in our church community with other people who know Jesus like we do. But then as you go outward, there are lessening levels of intimacy and trust. So the next circle out for people in your life might be people you know well enough to, go out to dinner with, or maybe hang out with, have some fun together. But these aren't people you're going to bare your soul to necessarily, right? These aren't people maybe you're going to weep with or things of that nature. Maybe you're not going to share sin with them, at least not yet, if they don't get into that intimate place in the center of the circle. They're just people that you're going to be around, that you're going to hang around every once in a while. You call them friends. This is probably the majority of people we call friends in our life. If we're all honest, these are the majority of people that we call friends. But then the next circle out might be people that we're acquainted with, or maybe we're friendly toward, but we don't really expect anything from them. They don't expect much from us. Probably not going to try to hang out with them very much, maybe even if at all. They're just around, in our circles of influence. But then, you can think this is how the circles work. You just kind of go out, so on and so forth, and you're able to label the kind of relationship that you have with each person, so you know how best to approach them and to love them and to serve them, right? Because the people that are on the outer circles, you're probably not going to give all of yourself to. That wouldn't be wise. But you might be able to give some measure of yourself to, and you need to know that and set up healthy boundaries. It's just how you set up boundaries. Not every person that you know and that you're in relationship with is going to be a close friend, and that's okay. And we need to recognize that. Christine Hoover, who's a pastor's wife and author, she talks a lot about friendship. She's written several books. I would highly recommend you look her up and read some of her books. She writes this in one of her books that I read this week. She says, not every relationship is a friendship, nor does it have to be. You don't have to be everyone's friend. In fact, it's not possible to be everyone's friend. Friendship's distinctive is mutuality, mutual vulnerability, mutual pursuit, mutual responsibility, mutual care, mutual concern. When we consider friendship in that vein, it's clear that not only are we unable to be friends with everyone, but also that it would be unwise to try. So she goes on to say that some people basically just want to use us. So some people want to abuse us. That's not true friendship when people want to do that and they need us. They're looking to us to fill their idolatry problem in that case. We need to be wise enough and mature enough in our faith to see that we do the same thing sometimes. And we need to be able to label that and put up appropriate boundaries and help share the gospel with them so that they can come to know Jesus or remind them of that gospel if they're believers, right? So it helps set up appropriate boundaries to know these things. And I know more needs to be said on that too, but for the sake of time, I want to just kind of land our plane here. I do want to say, though, that one thing to sacrifice in our lives, it's one thing to sacrifice. It's one thing to lay your life down for your friends. It's one thing to be selfless. But it's another thing entirely to let someone use or abuse you. And I just want to make sure I'm clear on saying that friendships don't do that. That's not true friendship. Jesus is not saying to let others abuse you over time. Now, you may have to take that. I mean, you think of the martyrs over the years and in places, I'm just thinking of some stories from communist China, communist Romania, all those different places. People had to lay their lives down for their friends at times. So it may require that of us. I'm not sure. But we have to just set, what I'm talking about here is setting up these healthy boundaries, trying to understand where we're at with people so that as we grow in our friendship with Jesus, we can help bring others into that. So we just need to make sure that we're understanding what Jesus is talking about here. But it's important, though, that if we're going to err on any side, it's probably going to be erring on the side of selflessness. It's going to be erring on the side of letting others hurt us at times because we're willing to risk more for the sake of the friendship. Now, that's a form of suffering that Jesus talks about. Paul talked about suffering in Philippians. So yeah, we're going to get hurt in those moments. But that's learning to lay your life down as much as you can. Jesus did that for us. So we can do that for others by his power. That's what the gospel pushes us toward. And guess what? If you're involved in the church community, then you're always going to have somebody else doing that for you too. And that's the beauty of the church. It's because you know that in relationship with other people who are in relationship with Jesus, they're going to try to serve you too. That's the safety and love of the church. Jesus did that for us. We can do it for others. And that's going to fuel us to keep pouring ourselves out. My wife has been such a godly example for me in this. I just want to commend her on that. She gives up early mornings to meet with some of you guys. She gives up her evenings to meet with some of y'all, even weekends at times. And that's what a true friend does for people. They give of themselves. They give them their time. They give up time with their children and their husband and all of that. And I want to give her space to do that. I don't ever want her to feel bad about doing that. She needs to cultivate other friendships than just my friendship with her. And she does the same for me. When I want to go hang out and smoke a cigar with my friends, she allows me to do that. When I want to have a Zoom call with my guys that are close to me, that are scattered all over North Carolina, South Carolina, she gives me time to do that. So we have to be selfless even with one another in that, to be able to cultivate our friendship in marriage for sure, so that she can cultivate and I can cultivate friendships with other people. It's learning to be selfless and cultivate deep friendships across our church community and other Christian community that we have in our lives. And that's actually going to cultivate our friendship even deeper. That's going to make our intimacy grow. So we have to learn how to do that with one another, even in the church. And I know there's so much more, again, we could say on friendships here. It's a massive topic, but let me leave you with this statistic that I thought was so interesting. We've been talking about this in our staff. A new guest in a church like ours has to make and cultivate 5 to 7 meaningful relationships in order to stick around here for 2 years or more. That's just one of the church growth statistics that are out there. Let me just ask you, do you have 5 to 7 meaningful relationships here at Redemption Church? And if not, why? Is it because you're afraid? Is it because you don't want to put yourself out there? Is it because nobody else has pursued you or reached out to you or been friendly toward you? I hope that's not the case. We try to be very hospitable here, but you've got to grow in these areas. Maybe you have a candor problem. that you're recognizing today. Maybe you have a consistency problem. Maybe you have both. Maybe you've been convicted today. How are you going to respond to what God is teaching us in this passage about friendship? Again, I know it's not easy, especially when we've trained ourselves for years not to engage with people in real ways, but to use the medium of phone, social media, virtual reality, all of those. But today, let's ask God to help us open ourselves up, to understand what relationships we have, to dwell on Jesus' friendship with us, and then work through us to help us cultivate relationships and friendships with candor and consistency. Let me pray for us today. God, thanks so much for listening with us today. We hope that it was an encouragement to you. But we don't see this as a replacement for gathering with other believers in a local church context. And so if you don't have a local church, we would encourage you to plug in with one wherever you are. And if you're in Roanoke, Virginia, we'd love to invite you to plug in with us here at Redemption Church. And you're welcome anytime to gather with us. But you can check us out online at our website, redemptionroanoke.com. You can look for other content or resources there. But thanks again for listening.